Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1937 when the first comprehensive reports of unusual activities at the Whitaker residence were filed in the municipal records of Clifton, Virginia. What began as whispers among neighbors would eventually become one of the most meticulously documented cases of psychological manipulation and collective delusion in American history. The Whitaker sisters, Evelyn, Margaret, and Elizabeth, were known throughout Fairfax County as respectable, educated women from a prominent family whose roots in the region stretched back to before the Civil War. Their father, William Whitaker, had been a successful banker before the crash of '29, with connections to financial institutions as far north as Boston. Though their fortune had diminished considerably during the Depression, they maintained an air of dignity that commanded respect in the community. Their Victorian home, situated on a wooded 5-acre property at the edge of town just off what is now Route 645, had been in the family for 3 generations. According to county property records examined in 1961 by local historian Martha Jenkins, the house was built in 1872 by the sisters' grandfather, Colonel James Whitaker, a veteran of the Confederate Army, who had managed to rebuild his wealth in the difficult years following the war. The house itself was an imposing 3-story structure with a distinctive mansard roof and wraparound porch, once painted a stately white with green trim, but by the 1930s showing significant signs of neglect. With its peeling paint and overgrown gardens, the house had become something of a local landmark, a visible symbol of how the Depression had affected even the most established families. The sisters, all unmarried and in their 30s and 40s by the time our story begins, lived in increasing isolation following their parents' deaths in 1931. What few knew was that behind the drawn curtains and locked doors of 147 Maple Street, something unspeakable was taking shape, a series of nocturnal rituals that would eventually lead 3 women of sound mind and respectable background to the darkest corners of human experience. This is the documented account of what has become known in certain academic circles as the Clifton incident, a case that has been largely forgotten by the general public but continues to disturb those who study the psychological extremes of human behavior. What follows is based on police reports, witness testimonies, personal journals, and psychiatric evaluations, all compiled from various archives and historical records dating back to the late 1930s and early 1940s. The story of the Whitaker sisters isn't one of supernatural phenomena, as they themselves might have claimed. There were no ghosts, no spirits returning from beyond. What happened in that house was entirely human, and perhaps that is what makes it all the more disturbing. This is a story about what isolation, grief, and obsession can do to the human mind, about how reality can bend and distort until it breaks entirely. It begins, as these stories often do, with a loss. In February of 1934, the eldest Whitaker sister, Evelyn, then 47, lost her fiancé, Dr. Thomas Bennett, to pneumonia. Though they had been engaged for nearly 15 years, they had never married, a fact that raised eyebrows in the community but was explained away as a matter of financial practicality during the Depression. According to town records, Bennett was a respected physician who had studied at Johns Hopkins University before returning to establish his practice in Clifton. He had treated many of the town's residents and was known for his willingness to make house calls, regardless of weather conditions or the patient's ability to pay. His death was noted in the February 5, 1934, edition of the Fairfax County Chronicle with a modest obituary, mentioning his dedication to his patients and his engagement to Missy Whitaker of Clifton. The article described how he had contracted pneumonia after spending a night treating the children of a poor family during a particularly severe snowstorm. He had developed a high fever on January 28th and despite the best efforts of colleagues who came from Washington, D.C. to assist, died on February 3rd. What the obituary didn't mention was that in the weeks before his death, Bennett had been making inquiries about having Evelyn evaluated by a colleague who specialized in mental disorders. This information was only discovered in 1968 when a former nurse at the Fairfax County Hospital, Judith Collins, found Bennett's private notes while organizing old medical records for archival storage. The notes, dated January 15, 1934, expressed concern about Evelyn's increasing preoccupation with matters of spiritualism and communication with the deceased. Bennett described how Evelyn had begun to wake in the night, claiming to hear voices calling to her from the family cemetery located at the far end of the Whitaker property. She insists these are not dreams, Bennett wrote, but actual auditory experiences that occur in the liminal state between sleeping and waking. Her description of these episodes suggests hypnagogic hallucinations, but her conviction that they represent actual communication is concerning. According to local records examined in 1962, the Whitaker family plot contained the remains of 3 generations, including the sisters' parents, William and Catherine Whitaker, who had died within months of each other in 1931, William from heart failure, and Catherine from what death certificates listed as general decline following prolonged melancholia. Bennett's notes suggested that Evelyn believed she was hearing her mother's voice, though he was careful to document this as a grief response rather than a psychiatric condition. He never had the chance to pursue his concerns. He died on February 3rd and was buried, at Evelyn's insistence, in the Whitaker family plot rather than in the cemetery of the Methodist Church where he had been a member. The minister's diary, found during a church archive reorganization in 1966, noted his discomfort with this arrangement, but his ultimate acquiescence out of respect for the grieving fiancé. For several months after Bennett's death, the Whitaker sisters were rarely seen in town. When they did appear, locals described them as changed. Margaret, the middle sister at 42, had always been the most sociable of the 3, serving on church committees and occasionally teaching piano to the children of prominent families. By summer, she had resigned from all her positions. The minutes of the Ladies' Aid Society meeting for June 1934 note her resignation with regret and concern for her well-being. Elizabeth, at 39 the youngest and previously employed as a librarian at the Clifton Public Library, requested a leave of absence that eventually became permanent. According to employment records at the library, Elizabeth's supervisor noted concerns about her appearance and behavior in the weeks before her departure. Miss Whitaker appears increasingly distracted and unkempt, wrote Mrs. Eleanor Simmons in a staff evaluation dated June 1934. Her normally impeccable appearance has deteriorated, with her hair often uncombed and her clothing wrinkled and occasionally stained. When questioned about her well-being, she speaks of being tired due to night work that she and her sisters must perform. When pressed for details, she becomes evasive, saying only that it is family business of the utmost importance. I fear she may be suffering from nervous exhaustion and have suggested she consult Dr. Harris, but she insists she is perfectly well, merely preoccupied. This night work would later become the center of the investigation into the Whitaker case. But in 1934 it raised few alarms. The Depression had forced many to take on unusual jobs and hours to make ends meet. If the sisters had found some means of supplementing their dwindling inheritance, few would question it, especially given the family's previously high standing in the community and their known financial difficulties following their father's losses in the crash. By autumn of 1934, however, the first reports of strange occurrences at the Whitaker home began to circulate. Herbert Miller, whose farm adjoined the Whitaker property to the north, reported to the local sheriff that he had observed lights moving through the woods near the family cemetery late at night. Miller, a lifelong resident of Clifton in his 60s, was not known for flights of fancy or imaginative tales. His statement to Sheriff Robert Johnson, dated October 12, 1934, was matter-of-fact. On multiple occasions over the past month, most recently on the night of October 10th, I have observed what appear to be lanterns or similar portable lights moving among the trees on the Whitaker property, specifically in the area surrounding their family burial ground. The lights follow no regular path and appear to move in circular patterns. This occurs generally between the hours of midnight and 3 in the morning. Initially, the sheriff dismissed Miller's concerns, suggesting it was likely the sisters visiting their parents' graves, though he admitted the hour was unusual. When Miller insisted the lights followed no normal pattern, and that he sometimes heard a woman's voice raised in something like song, the sheriff made a cursory investigation, which revealed nothing unusual. The report, filed on October 15, 1934, stated simply, "Investigated complaint of unusual activities on Whitaker property. Spoke with Miss E. Whitaker, who stated that she and her sisters occasionally visit family graves in evening hours when temperature is cooler. No evidence of illegal activity or disturbance. Matter closed." Had the authorities taken Miller's reports more seriously, perhaps what followed might have been prevented. But in a small community like Clifton, with limited resources and no real evidence of wrongdoing, there was little motivation to investigate further. The Whitakers were still, despite their reduced circumstances, considered a founding family of the town, and there was a natural reluctance to intrude on their privacy without substantial cause. The winter of 1934-35 was particularly harsh in Virginia. Weather reports from Washington, D.C. stations note that December brought record snowfalls with accumulations of over 20 inches reported in parts of Fairfax County. Heavy snowfall isolated many rural homes, including the Whitakers. For nearly 2 months, no one from town saw or heard from the sisters. The road to their property, never properly maintained even in better times, became impassable. When spring came, bringing with it the thaw, Margaret Whitaker reappeared at the general store, purchasing large quantities of candles, salt, and black cloth. The store owner, Joseph Campbell, noted in his ledger that Miss Whitaker appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, as though recovering from illness. His personal diary, discovered by his grandson in 1964, contained a more detailed description. Margaret Whitaker came in today for the first time since before Christmas. I hardly recognized her. She has lost a considerable amount of weight, and her skin has a grayish cast to it. Her hands trembled as she made her purchases, and she started visibly when the bell rang as another customer entered. When I inquired after her sisters, she replied simply that they were engaged in important work and could not leave the house. She purchased an unusual assortment of items: 24 beeswax candles, 10 pounds of salt, and 15 yards of black cotton cloth. When I remarked on the quantity, she said only that preparations must be complete, but did not elaborate on what she was preparing for. What this important work entailed would remain unknown until much later, when Elizabeth Whitaker's journal was discovered. The journal, covering the period from March 1934 to September 1937, provides the most comprehensive account of what transpired within the Whitaker home. It was recovered in 1968 by Professor Harold Jenkins of Georgetown University, who was researching historical cases of shared psychosis for a monograph that was never published. The journal had been stored in the Fairfax County Historical Society archives, incorrectly cataloged as household accounts. The journal itself was a leather-bound volume of the type commonly used for financial records, with lined pages and a sturdy binding. Elizabeth's handwriting, initially neat and precise, fills nearly 300 pages, becoming increasingly erratic and difficult to decipher in later entries. The first entry following Bennett's death, dated March 1, 1934, described her sister Evelyn's behavior in clinical detail. E no longer sleeps. She sits at her window facing the cemetery path, waiting, she says, for T to return with a message. She claims she can hear him calling to her just before dawn, but the words are unclear. M tries to reason with her, suggesting it is merely the wind in the pine trees. But I fear she is beginning to believe E's claims that the dead can speak. Last night I found them both at the window at 3 in the morning, listening intently to what they assured me were voices. I heard nothing but the normal sounds of the night. By April, Elizabeth was documenting Evelyn's growing obsession with what she called the conditions of communication. An entry dated April 17th reads, "E. has been reading extensively in Father's library, particularly those volumes on ancient spiritualist practices that he kept hidden behind his medical texts. She speaks constantly of thinning the veil and creating the right conditions. Today she burned all of T's letters, saying the physical must be destroyed for the spiritual to manifest. When I objected, she became uncharacteristically angry, insisting that T himself had instructed her to do this. When I asked how she could know his wishes, she touched her temple and said, 'He tells me here.'" By June, Elizabeth was documenting what she called the sessions, gatherings in the Whitaker dining room, where Evelyn would attempt to make contact with Bennett's spirit. "E. has covered the mirrors and windows with black cloth. She says reflections distract from the voices. The room is kept in near total darkness, with only a single candle burning in the center of the table. We sit for hours in silence, broken only by E.'s occasional questions directed to empty air. M. now fully participates, claiming she too can hear faint whispers when the candles are arranged in the pattern E has devised, a circle with 5 points marked by smaller candles. I remain skeptical, but sit with them out of concern for their mental state. Elizabeth's initial skepticism was evident in her early entries, where she referred to her sister's activities as this morbid game and expressed worry about their increasing detachment from reality. But by August, her tone had changed. "Last night I heard it too. Not T's voice, as he claims, but something. A sound like breathing close to my ear when no one was near. E says this is just the beginning, that soon we will hear clear voices, receive clear instructions. She has begun to create what she calls the lexicon, a system of symbols and corresponding sounds that she says will help us understand what we hear. The symbols mean nothing to me, but E copies them with intense concentration, claiming they come to her in dreams. The instructions Elizabeth mentioned would become increasingly elaborate and disturbing over the next 3 years. According to her journal, Evelyn believed she was receiving specific directions from Bennett on how to create conditions that would allow him to return and communicate more clearly. These conditions involved a complex set of rituals to be performed only at night, particularly during the dark of the moon. The first major ritual documented in Elizabeth's journal took place in October 1934. The sisters prepared by fasting for 3 days, then gathered in the dining room, which had been cleared of all furniture, except for a round table that had belonged to their grandmother. They sat in darkness for hours, breathing in unison, according to a pattern Evelyn had supposedly received from Bennett. 7 breaths in, hold for 7 counts, 7 breaths out, repeated indefinitely. Elizabeth wrote that around midnight the temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and a sound like distant music seemed to emanate from the walls. "I am certain there was no source for this sound," she wrote on October 24th. "Our nearest neighbor is half a mile away, and this was not like any instrument I have ever heard, more like voices singing in a language I do not recognize." E became extremely excited, saying, "He's breaking through." The sound lasted for perhaps 5 minutes, then faded. E insisted we not move for the remainder of the night, and we sat in silence until dawn. My back and legs ached terribly, but E's face showed such rapture that I dared not complain. Following this experience, Evelyn declared that Bennett had made contact, but that stronger measures would be needed to maintain the connection. It was at this point that the rituals began to escalate. Elizabeth's journal entries describe how Evelyn insisted they begin sleeping during daylight hours and remaining awake all night. Their meals were restricted to foods prepared according to specific rules. Nothing red, nothing that had been sweetened, nothing that had been stored in metal containers. Bread could only be eaten if it had been baked during a waning moon. Water could only be drunk if it had stood in a glass container in moonlight for at least 3 hours. These dietary restrictions, combined with the disruption to their normal sleep patterns, likely contributed to the physical and mental deterioration documented in later entries. By December 1934, The sisters had converted the dining room into what Elizabeth called the communication chamber. The windows were permanently sealed with the black cloth Margaret had purchased. The walls were covered with intricate diagrams that Evelyn claimed had been dictated to her by Bennett. These diagrams, later described by the police who investigated the house, consisted of concentric circles filled with text written in a cipher that has never been fully decoded. A photograph of one such diagram, taken by police in 1937 and included in the case file, shows a series of interlocking circles containing hundreds of small, precisely drawn symbols. Some resemble letters from various alphabets, Greek, Hebrew, and what appears to be a form of runic script, while others are entirely unfamiliar, consisting of complex arrangements of lines and dots. According to Elizabeth's journal, Evelyn spent hours each day adding to these diagrams, often working in a state she described as trance-like, her hand moving across the paper without apparent conscious direction. The rituals continued to evolve throughout 1935. Elizabeth's journal entries from this period show her increasing acceptance of her eldest sister's beliefs. E says we must record our dreams immediately upon waking, as they contain messages. M and I have begun to notice similarities in what we dream. The same location, a clearing in woods we've never seen, with a standing stone at its center. E says this is T, showing us where to conduct the next phase of the work. She has begun to explore the wooded areas of our property, searching for this clearing. By March 1935, Evelyn claimed to have found the location from their shared dreams, a small open area in the densest part of the woods, not far from the family cemetery. According to Elizabeth's journal, there was indeed a standing stone there, though she described it as likely nothing more than a boundary marker from when the property lines were first established. Nonetheless, this location became the focus of new rituals, conducted during the hours around midnight. Elizabeth described these outdoor sessions in detail. He has laid out a circle of salt around the stone with candles placed at specific intervals. We sit outside this circle, facing outward, while E stands beside the stone and recites passages from what she calls the text. Portions of her cipher that she has determined are meant to be spoken aloud. The sound of these words is unlike any language I know, harsh and full of consonants that seem to catch in the throat. Last night, as she reached what she called the invocation, a wind rose suddenly, though the trees around us remained still. M claimed to see a light moving among the trees, but I saw nothing. By summer, Elizabeth was fully immersed in what she now called the work. Her handwriting, once neat and precise, had become erratic. She wrote of experiencing periods of lost time, particularly during the night rituals. Sometimes I find myself in different rooms of the house with no memory of having moved. E says this is a sign that we are becoming more receptive to the influences from beyond. She says the barriers between life and death are artificial, created by limited human perception, and that through our work we are learning to perceive the true nature of existence. I find myself believing her, though some small part of me still questions whether we have gone too far. It was around this time that the first concerning incidents involving outsiders occurred. In July 1935, a local teenager named James Wright claimed to have been pursued through the woods adjoining the Whitaker property by a woman in white. Moving strangely, Wright, 16 at the time, had been hunting for rabbits with his dog when he strayed close to the Whitaker land. In a statement given to Sheriff Johnson, he described hearing a sound like singing, but not in any language I ever heard, and going to investigate, thinking it might be kids fooling around. I saw a clearing with candles all around, Wright stated, and something that looked like writing on the ground. Before I could make sense of it, a woman in a white dress came out of the trees. She moved real strange, kind of jerky-like, and she called out something I couldn't understand. My dog started growling and then just took off running. The woman started coming toward me real fast, and I ran too. I could hear her behind me for a good while, but I didn't look back. The boy's father reported the incident to the sheriff, who again conducted a perfunctory investigation. The sisters denied any knowledge of the incident, and with no evidence of wrongdoing, the matter was dropped. The sheriff's report concluded that the boy had likely seen one of the Whitaker sisters taking a walk on their property and, startled, had misinterpreted her actions. However, Elizabeth's journal tells a different story. An entry dated July 17, 1935 reads, "E says we must protect the boundaries. The boy nearly stumbled upon us during the midnight observance. M pursued him to ensure he did not return or bring others. She was still in her ceremonial dress, which may have frightened him. But E says fear serves our purpose by keeping intruders away. E says we must be more careful about when and where we conduct the outer rituals. She has begun to draw diagrams on the trees surrounding our working area, saying they will discourage casual observation. These outer rituals, as Elizabeth called them, apparently took place in the wooded areas of the property, particularly near the family cemetery. Her descriptions are vague, but they seem to have involved the creation of patterns on the ground using salt, the placement of candles in specific formations, and the sisters moving in choreographed patterns while reciting texts that Evelyn claimed had been dictated by Bennett. Throughout the remainder of 1935 and into 1936, the sisters' isolation deepened. According to town records, they paid a local boy, Samuel Turner, to deliver groceries, leaving a list and money in a box at the end of their driveway. Turner, who was 12 at the time, later told investigators that he never saw the sisters, only occasionally hearing singing from inside the house when he approached the porch to leave the groceries. "It wasn't like church singing," he said in a statement recorded in 1937. "It was low and kind of humming, with no words I could make out. Sometimes there'd be a louder voice over top of it, saying things real fast. I didn't like it, but my ma said we needed the money they paid, so I kept doing it." Elizabeth's journal entries from this period become increasingly disjointed and difficult to follow. She wrote of visitations and manifestations, though she never clearly described what these entailed. What is clear is that by mid-1936, all three sisters believed they were in regular communication not only with Bennett, but with other deceased family members and even historical figures. "He says the veil continues to thin," Elizabeth wrote in June 1936. "Last night, we received communication from Father, who provided detailed instructions on modifications to the chamber. M wept when she heard his voice, though E reminded her that emotional reactions disrupt the frequencies. E says we are approaching a critical threshold and must maintain absolute discipline. She has added a new element to our preparation, a tincture she creates from herbs grown in the garden, which we must consume before each session. It produces a sensation of lightness and clarity that E says enhances our receptivity. The tincture Elizabeth mentioned has never been identified, as no samples were recovered from the house. However, botanical experts who examined the overgrown garden in 1937 noted the presence of several plants with known psychoactive properties, including Datura stramonium, jimsonweed, and Hyoscyamus niger, henbane, both of which can produce hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. These plants were not native to the area and had apparently been deliberately cultivated. A particularly disturbing entry from September 1936 reads, "E says we have made a breakthrough." The voice that came through tonight was not T or any of our known contacts. It identified itself as one who has never lived but has always been. E was elated, but I felt a coldness that seemed to drain all warmth from my body. M fainted and could not be roused for nearly an hour. When she finally woke, she said she had been elsewhere and described a landscape unlike any on Earth, a plain of gray dust under a black sky with no stars. E said this was a tremendous advance in our work, but I find myself increasingly uneasy. The presence that manifests during our sessions no longer feels like T. It feels older and somehow hungry. Following this incident, Elizabeth's journal describes a shift in the nature of their rituals. No longer focused solely on communication, they now aimed at what she called manifestation, creating conditions that would allow whatever they had contacted to take physical form. The preparations for these attempts became increasingly elaborate and disturbing. E has determined that the manifestation requires a vessel, she wrote in October 1936. She has been collecting items associated with T, his medical bag, which she retrieved from his office after his death. A lock of his hair, which she had kept in a locket. Pages from his journals, these are arranged in a specific pattern within the inner circle of the chamber. During our sessions, E now wears T's clothing, his shirts which she has altered to fit her smaller frame. She says this creates a sympathetic connection that will help guide him back. I find this practice disturbing, but E insists it is necessary. In November 1936, Margaret Whitaker made her last recorded appearance in town. She visited Dr. William Harris, who had taken over Bennett's practice after his death. According to Dr. Harris's notes, found in 1965 during a review of his papers for a local medical history project, Margaret appeared severely malnourished and complained of insomnia and waking visions, patient presence with significant weight loss, pallor, and signs of nutritional deficiency. Harris wrote, "She reports having not slept for more than 2-3 hours at a time for several months, and describes seeing shadowy figures in her peripheral vision even when fully awake. When questioned about diet, she became evasive, saying only that she follows special requirements. She requested medication for what she called excessive receptivity, while stating that she sometimes feels occupied by external consciousness. I prescribed phenobarbital for sleep and strongly recommended hospitalization for further assessment. Patient refused, becoming agitated and saying, 'We cannot leave the house now. The work is at a critical stage.' When Harris suggested he might visit the house to check on all three sisters, Margaret reportedly became even more agitated, saying, 'No one must interrupt the work. We are so close now. He is almost here.' Harris, concerned but with no legal authority to intervene, made a report to the sheriff. Once again, a deputy was sent to the Whitaker house, but was turned away at the door by Evelyn, who assured him that Margaret was simply suffering from nervous exhaustion and was resting comfortably. With no evidence of immediate danger and respecting the privacy of a prominent local family, the authorities took no further action. Elizabeth's journal entries from December 1936 through February 1937 are sparse and often incoherent. She wrote of the presence growing stronger, of objects moving without being touched, of voices that could now be heard even during daylight hours. She described Evelyn as transformed, saying, "E no longer seems to sleep at all. Her eyes have taken on a luminous quality, especially in dim light. She speaks often in a voice that is not her own, deeper, with an accent I cannot place. She says this is T speaking through her, but it sounds nothing like him. Yesterday she spoke for hours in the cipher language, her hands moving constantly, drawing symbols in the air. M watched in rapture, but I felt only dread. Whatever speaks through E now, I am increasingly certain it is not T." By spring of 1937, the situation at the Whitaker house had deteriorated dramatically. The local delivery boy, Samuel Turner, refused to continue bringing groceries, telling his mother that on his last visit he had heard screaming like someone being hurt, coming from inside. His mother reported this to the sheriff, who this time decided a more thorough investigation was warranted. On April 15, 1937, deputies Robert Jenkins and Thomas Moore approached the Whitaker house. Finding the front door ajar, they entered the premises. What they discovered would be documented in police reports that remained sealed until 1960, when they were released to the Fairfax County Historical Society as part of an archive of notable local cases. According to the deputy's testimony, the house was in a state of severe neglect. The entrance hall and parlor were filled with dust and cobwebs, apparently unused for months. As they proceeded deeper into the house, they found the walls covered with writing in the same cipher seen in the communication chamber. The kitchen contained rotting food and unwashed dishes, suggesting it had been abandoned for some time. Deputy Jenkins's report describes in detail what they found as they moved through the house. The staircase to the second floor was blocked by furniture, chairs and tables stacked in a manner that appeared deliberate rather than haphazard. Some of these items were positioned in patterns that made no obvious sense, but seemed intentional in their placement. The walls of the central hallway were covered with what appeared to be writing in an unknown language or code drawn directly onto the wallpaper with what looked like charcoal or black ink. Some sections of wall had been stripped of paper entirely, with the same symbols carved into the plaster. Beneath, when they reached the dining room, the communication chamber described in Elizabeth's journal, they found Margaret and Elizabeth Whitaker seated at the round table, both in a state of extreme emaciation. Deputy Moore described them as hardly recognizable as the women they had been, noting that both were severely underweight, with skin stretched tight over their facial bones and hair that had gone completely white. Neither responded to the deputy's questions or appeared to register their presence. Medical examinations would later determine that both women were in a state of severe malnutrition and dehydration, with multiple vitamin deficiencies and signs of prolonged sleep deprivation. The communication chamber itself was described in the police report as unlike anything I have ever witnessed in 20 years of law enforcement. The windows were covered with black cloth, allowing no natural light to enter. The walls were completely covered with the cipher writing, which Deputy Jenkins noted appeared to have been applied in layers, with newer writing overlapping older, creating a palimpsest effect that made individual symbols difficult to discern. The round table at which the sisters sat bore a complex diagram, drawn in what laboratory analysis would later determine was a mixture of ash, salt, and dried herbs. Arranged around this diagram were 27 candles of varying heights, though only 3 were lit at the time of the deputy's entry. Most disturbing was what Deputy Moore described as a construction in the center of the table that appeared to be an attempt at creating a human form from various materials. This construction consisted of what seemed to be clothing, specifically men's shirts and ties arranged in a roughly human shape, with a medical bag positioned where the head would be. Inside this bag, deputies found a pocket watch, a ring, and a lock of hair later identified as having belonged to Thomas Bennett. Evelyn Whitaker was not in the room. A search of the house failed to locate her, and the deputies expanded their search to the grounds. It was Deputy Moore who discovered the path leading to the family cemetery, noting that it appeared to have been recently and frequently used. Following it, he found Evelyn Whitaker at the gravesite of Thomas Bennett. The official report describes her as seated on the grave, engaged in conversation with an unseen party. When approached, she reportedly told Deputy Moore, "You're too late. He's already coming through. The gate is open." She offered no resistance when told she needed to return to the house and accompany the deputies to town. A subsequent examination of Bennett's grave by county officials revealed disturbing evidence of tampering. The earth had been disturbed, and when exhumed under court order on April 20, 1937, it was discovered that the coffin had been opened. According to the coroner's report, certain personal items buried with Bennett, including his pocket watch, wedding ring, and a lock of hair that had been placed in the coffin by Evelyn, had been removed. These were later identified as the same items found in the medical bag in the communication chamber. All 3 sisters were taken to Fairfax County Hospital, where they were admitted to the psychiatric ward. The medical reports, partially redacted when released to the Historical Society, indicate that Margaret and Elizabeth eventually recovered physically, though both remained in a state described as profound dissociative disorder. Neither ever provided a coherent account of what had occurred in the house. Margaret, according to hospital records, rarely spoke and spent most of her time staring at blank walls, occasionally tracing symbols in the air with her fingers. Elizabeth showed more awareness of her surroundings but suffered from what doctors described as significant memory fragmentation and was unable to provide a coherent narrative of the preceding 3 years. When shown her journal, she reportedly claimed not to recognize the handwriting as her own, despite clear evidence that it was. Evelyn, however, was another matter. Dr. Richard Stevens, the psychiatrist who treated her, kept detailed notes of their sessions. These notes, discovered in 1966 during a review of hospital archives, provide a disturbing glimpse into Evelyn's mental state. According to Dr. Stevens, Evelyn was lucid and articulate, insisting that everything that had occurred had been part of a scientific experiment in communication with the deceased. Miss Whitaker speaks of her activities with the conviction of a researcher discussing a legitimate field of study, Stevens wrote. She expresses no concern for her sister's condition, stating only that they were weak vessels who could not withstand the rigors of the work. When questioned about the nature of this work, she becomes evasive, saying only that they had succeeded in opening a door and that what has begun cannot be stopped. She refers often to an entity she calls the intermediary, which she claims facilitated communication with her fiancé, but which, she admits, eventually assumed prominence in their sessions. When asked directly if she believes she was in contact with Bennett's spirit, she laughs and says, "Thomas was merely the key that fit the lock." What came through was much older. Stevens documented Evelyn's declining mental state over the following months. Initially cooperative and articulate, she gradually became more withdrawn and began to exhibit the same pattern of creating cipher symbols that had been observed in the house. By August 1937, she had stopped speaking entirely, communicating only through written notes in the same indecipherable script found on the walls of her home. Samples of this script, included in Dr. Stevens's files, show a complex system of symbols that bear little resemblance to any known writing system. Linguistic experts from the University of Virginia, who examined them in 1955, concluded that while the symbols showed internal consistency, suggesting they were not random markings, they did not correspond to any documented language or code. Dr. Harold Blumenthal, who led the analysis, noted the symbols exhibit patterns consistent with a constructed language rather than random psychotic output. There are recurring elements that appear to function as grammatical markers, and the overall structure suggests a systematic attempt to create a means of communication. Whether this system was entirely the creation of Miss Whitaker's disturbed mind or derived from some external source cannot be determined, but it represents a remarkable example of the human brain's capacity for complex pattern generation even in states of severe psychological distress. Evelyn Whitaker remained institutionalized until her death in 1952. Hospital records indicate that she never wavered in her beliefs and continued to perform what staff described as ritual behaviors whenever left unobserved. Nurses' logs documented her habit of arranging her personal items in specific geometric patterns on her bed or floor and her tendency to orient herself toward the east during certain hours of the night, swaying rhythmically while murmuring in her created language. Margaret died in the same institution in 1949, having never recovered. Her medical file contains a note from Dr. Stevens dated March 10, 1949, just 2 days before her death. Patient continues to exist in a dissociative state. Physical decline accelerating despite adequate nutrition. The phenomenon known as given up complex seems applicable. She has simply lost the will to continue. Most concerning is the fact that when I informed Evelyn of her sister's condition this morning, her response was not grief but excitement. "She's going to the other side," she said. "Now we'll know for certain if the channel remains open." Elizabeth, showing some improvement, was released to the care of distant relatives in California in 1941. According to correspondence in Dr. Stevens's files, she appeared to be adjusting to normal life, though she refused to discuss her experiences in the Whitaker house and reportedly suffered from severe insomnia and occasional episodes of what her cousin described as absence, though her mind simply leaves her body for minutes at a time. On February 12, 1943, Elizabeth Whitaker committed suicide by hanging herself from a beam in her cousin's garage in San Diego. She left behind a note that read only, "It's still calling. I must go back." Her cousin later told investigators that in the weeks leading up to her death, Elizabeth had become increasingly agitated, claiming to hear voices at night and insisting that something is trying to come through. A particularly disturbing detail emerged in the police report. Elizabeth had covered the walls of her bedroom with the same cipher symbols found in the Whitaker house in Virginia, apparently drawn with her own blood from self-inflicted cuts on her arms. The Whitaker house remained abandoned until 1956, when it was purchased by a developer named Robert Mitchell, who intended to renovate it for use as a small hotel or boarding house. According to local newspaper reports from the Fairfax County Chronicle, the project was abandoned after several workers refused to continue, citing uncomfortable feelings and unexplained sounds. An article dated June 3, 1956, quoted carpenter James Wilson as saying, "There's something not right about that place. Tools go missing, then turn up arranged in patterns that nobody admits to making, and the sounds like whispering in the walls, but not in any language I ever heard. Most of us won't go back in there, not for any amount of money." Mitchell attempted to continue the renovation with a new crew, but encountered additional problems. An unexplained fire damaged the former dining room in July 1956, and recurring electrical issues plagued the property despite complete rewiring. In October 1956, Mitchell himself reportedly experienced what he described as a presence while inspecting the upper floors. According to his statement to the local paper, he was measuring a room when he felt someone watching me from the corner. When I turned, I saw what looked like a woman in old-fashioned clothes, but when I blinked, there was no one there. But the feeling of being watched remained, and I heard what sounded like someone whispering right into my ear, though I couldn't make out the words. The house was finally demolished in 1960, and the land was subdivided for new construction. During the demolition process, workers discovered additional evidence of the sisters' activities. Behind a wall in the master bedroom, apparently sealed up sometime in 1936, according to Elizabeth's journal entries, they found a cache of items including medical instruments that were identified as having belonged to Dr. Bennett. Several notebooks filled with the cipher writing, and most disturbing, what appeared to be human teeth and bone fragments. These were sent to the FBI laboratory in Washington for analysis. But the results of this examination were never made public, and the materials themselves were reportedly lost during an archive reorganization in the early 1970s. The Whitaker case might have been forgotten entirely if not for the discovery of Elizabeth's journal and the subsequent research by Professor Jenkins. His interest in the case led to the release of the police reports and medical records, piecing together the story that had been largely lost to time. What makes the Whitaker case particularly disturbing is not any supernatural element. Indeed, all evidence points to a tragic case of shared psychosis triggered by grief and isolation, but rather how three educated, rational women could descend into such extremes of delusion and self-harm. The rituals they performed were not based on any recognized spiritual or occult tradition, but were apparently created entirely by Evelyn, perhaps influenced by her deteriorating mental state after the loss of her fiancé. Professor Jenkins, in his unpublished monograph, Shared Psychotic Disorder, the Whitaker Sisters Case Study, proposed that Evelyn, as the dominant personality, developed what would now be classified as a psychotic disorder following the trauma of Bennett's death. Her sisters, isolated with her in the family home and dependent on her both emotionally and financially, gradually came to share her delusions in a classic example of what was then called folie à trois, a shared psychotic disorder involving three people. What is remarkable in the Whitaker case, Jenkins wrote, is not merely that the sisters shared a delusion, but the elaborate nature of the belief system they constructed. The creation of a complex symbolic language, the development of intricate rituals, and the physical transformation of their environment all point to an extraordinarily detailed and internally consistent psychotic framework. This level of complexity is rarely seen in cases of shared psychosis and suggests that Evelyn Whitaker, despite her mental illness, possessed a remarkable intellect and creative capacity. The cipher used in their writings has been studied by cryptographers from various institutions with no consensus on its meaning. Some believe it was a genuine attempt to create a language for communicating with the dead. Others suggest it was simply the product of Evelyn's disordered thinking, a system that held meaning only to her. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a linguistics professor who studied the symbols in 1962, noted that they contained structural elements reminiscent of both logographic writing systems like Chinese and phonetic systems like Sanskrit, suggesting that Evelyn had some knowledge of comparative linguistics, perhaps from books in her father's library. What is most intriguing, Dr. Montgomery wrote in the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, is that the system shows development over time. Samples from 1934 are simpler and less internally consistent than those from 1936-37, indicating that whatever its origin, this writing system evolved and became more sophisticated as the sisters' delusions deepened. This suggests a mind that, though functioning within a delusional framework, retained significant intellectual capacity and creativity. The final disturbing element of the Whitaker case came to light in 1968, when the remains in the family cemetery were relocated due to highway construction. During the exhumation process, workers discovered that the grave of Thomas Bennett had been disturbed. According to the coroner's report, the casket had been opened from above, and certain personal items, including his pocket watch and a ring, had been removed. These items were later found among Evelyn's possessions at the hospital, carefully preserved in a box she kept beneath her bed. More disturbing was the discovery that Bennett's remains showed evidence of post-mortem manipulation. The coroner's report noted that the body had been rearranged in a manner inconsistent with normal decomposition or animal disturbance. Specifically, the bones of the hands had been placed on the chest in a specific pattern that corresponded to one of the symbols in Evelyn's cipher. Additionally, small objects had been placed inside the coffin that were not present at the original burial, including stones arranged in patterns and small cloth pouches containing herbs and what analysis determined to be human hair, likely from the Whitaker sisters themselves. Dr. James Morton, the forensic pathologist who examined the remains, wrote in his report, "The evidence suggests repeated access to the coffin over a period of time, with ritualistic manipulation of the remains. The precision of the bone arrangements indicates careful, deliberate action rather than hasty disturbance." This level of post-mortem interaction is extremely unusual and suggests a profound detachment from normal taboos. Regarding the dead, what actually transpired in the Whitaker house between 1934 and 1937 will never be fully known. Elizabeth's journal provides a chronology, but is filtered through her own increasingly disordered perceptions. The physical evidence found by police, the covered windows, the cipher-covered walls, the elaborate patterns drawn on floors and tables, suggest a methodical approach to whatever the sisters believed they were doing. Dr. Stevens, who continued to study the case long after the sisters were no longer his patients, proposed in a 1955 paper that the entire phenomenon represented a remarkable example of how the human mind, when faced with overwhelming grief and isolation, can construct an alternative reality so detailed and internally consistent that it becomes, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from objective reality for those within its influence. Perhaps most chilling are the final words written in Elizabeth's journal, dated just days before the deputy's intervention. "It no longer needs the rituals. It no longer needs us to call it. It comes whether we summon it or not. Sometimes I see it standing at the foot of my bed, wearing a face that is almost, but not quite, human. E says, 'This is what success looks like. I am no longer certain I want this success.' The entity speaks through E more often now, and when it does, she is not my sister. Yesterday it said, 'It has always been here, waiting for someone to open the door, and that now the door cannot be closed.' When I asked what it wanted, E, or whatever was speaking through her, smiled and said, 'To wear your world like a garment.'" The Whitaker case remains a disturbing example of how isolation and obsession can warp the human mind. It stands as a warning about the fragility of our grip on reality and how, Under certain circumstances, that grip can slip, not through supernatural forces, but through the all-too-human experiences of grief, loneliness, and the desperate desire to deny the finality of death. In the small town of Clifton, Virginia, few remember the Whitaker sisters today. The land where their house once stood is now occupied by a shopping center. The family cemetery was relocated to make way for a highway. Nothing physical remains to mark their story. Yet, in certain academic circles, the case is still studied. The journals, the police reports, the medical records, all pieces of a puzzle that can never be completely solved. What is known with certainty is that 3 women who began with all the advantages of education, social position, and sound mind were gradually consumed by something that began as grief and transformed into obsession. In the words of Professor Jenkins, who devoted years to studying the case, the Whitakers believed they were speaking to the dead. Perhaps the true horror is not that they were wrong, but that in their minds they were right, and that conviction was enough to destroy them. A footnote to the story emerged in 1969, when a former nurse at Fairfax County Hospital came forward with an account of Evelyn Whitaker's final days. According to this witness, who requested anonymity when interviewed by Jenkins, Evelyn remained lucid until shortly before her death, when she began to speak continuously to someone no one else could see. It was the night before she died, the nurse recalled. I was checking on patients around midnight when I heard her talking in her room. I thought perhaps another patient had wandered in, but when I looked, she was alone, sitting up in bed, and having what appeared to be a detailed conversation with an empty chair beside her. What struck me was how normal she seemed, not like someone hallucinating, but like someone speaking to a visitor. She was smiling and nodding, and at one point she laughed quite naturally. When she saw me in the doorway, she said, "He's come to take me home." I asked who she meant, and she replied, "Thomas, of course. He's been waiting all this time." She seemed so rational that, for a moment, I almost believed someone was there. The nurse reported that Evelyn continued conversing with the unseen presence throughout the night. Her last recorded words, spoken to empty air beside her bed, were, "You see, I kept my promise. Now it's your turn to keep yours." She died peacefully in her sleep just before dawn on October 15, 1952. What promise she believed she had kept, and what she expected in return, died with her. The Whitaker sisters took their secrets to their graves, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and a disturbing question. How thin is the barrier between grief and madness, and how easily can it be crossed by those who refuse to accept the silence of death? The investigation into the Whitaker case was officially closed in 1960 when the house was demolished. The cipher symbols, despite decades of study, have never been fully decoded. The exact nature of the entity the sisters believed they contacted remains unknown, most likely a manifestation of Evelyn's psychosis, though some researchers have noted similarities between her descriptions and certain archetypes found in various cultural mythologies. Dr. Stevens, in his final paper on the case published shortly before his retirement in 1965, wrote, "Whatever the Whitaker sisters believed they encountered, the real horror of their story lies in the human capacity for self-delusion. Given the right circumstances, isolation, emotional trauma, a dominant personality, and willing participants, the mind can create experiences so vivid and convincing that they become more real than reality itself. The Whitakers did not need supernatural forces to destroy themselves. They had something far more powerful and dangerous, the unlimited capacity of the human mind to believe. To this day, residents of the new housing developments built on what was once Whitaker land report unusual occurrences, cold spots, unexplained sounds, the sensation of being watched. Most dismiss these as the natural creaks and settling of houses, or the power of suggestion from knowing the land's history. Local teenagers occasionally dare each other to spend the night near where the house once stood, particularly on the anniversary of the sisters' removal to the hospital. But occasionally, someone will report seeing 3 women walking together at dusk, heading toward where the family cemetery once stood. By the time police arrive, there is never anyone there, just an empty path through trees that whisper in the Virginia wind. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Whitaker sisters, not evidence of communication with the dead, but a reminder of how the human mind can create its own hauntings, its own terrors. In the end, no supernatural explanation is needed for what happened in that house. The greatest horrors are those we create ourselves, in the dark chambers of isolation and obsession. The case file on the Whitaker sisters was officially closed in 1960. The house is gone, the graves relocated, the principals long dead. But in archives and historical societies, the documents remain, waiting, perhaps, for someone else to piece together the full story of three women who claim to speak with the dead, and who may have convinced themselves that something answered. In a final curious epilogue to the story, Professor Jenkins himself became something of a casualty of his research. Colleagues at Georgetown University reported that in the months before his death in 1969, he had become increasingly obsessed with the Whitaker cipher, covering the walls of his office with reproductions of the symbols and claiming to have discovered a key to their meaning. His monograph was never completed. The manuscript found after his death consisted mostly of pages filled with his own attempt at reproducing the cipher, with marginal notes that grew increasingly incoherent. The official cause of his death was listed as a cerebral hemorrhage, but rumors persisted in academic circles that he had been found in circumstances reminiscent of Elizabeth Whitaker's suicide, surrounded by the very symbols he had spent years studying. These rumors, however, were never substantiated, and his family maintained that his death, while unexpected, was due to natural causes. The Whitaker case now exists primarily as a footnote in psychiatric literature, occasionally referenced in discussions of folie à deux, or in this case, à trois, and the power of suggestion in isolated groups. For those few who have studied it in detail, it remains a disturbing example of how the mind, that most mysterious of human attributes, can create realities more terrifying than any supernatural horror. As Dr. Stevens wrote in his final notes on the case, "We think ourselves rational beings, anchored firmly in objective reality. The Whitakers remind us how tenuous that anchor can be, and how easily we can drift into waters where the boundaries between the real and the imagined dissolve entirely. And perhaps, in the quiet woods where the Whitaker house once stood, something still waits, not a ghost or spirit, but the echo of three minds that convinced themselves they had opened a door that could never be closed." A cautionary tale for those who might be tempted to believe that the dead can speak, and that some questions are better left unanswered.